I know the struggle. All right. You good to go?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is Adopt Responsibility number 5 with Caleb Landis and Matthew Whedon. And today we wanted to get into a discussion about the sovereignty of the individual and the difference between group dynamics and individual dynamics. And so I thought I would start, Caleb, by reading to you this little just text document I've been writing over the last few weeks. And yeah, just get your feedback on it. It's kind of like a second draft. It's definitely not a final draft, just slightly beyond a first draft, I guess.
Perfect. That's exactly where we should be reading it. I love it.
All right. Okay. So first, some definitions. To seek equality of opportunity is to make sure that every individual in a society gets the same treatment. That is what the civil rights movement and first wave feminism were all about. Individuals demanding their equal opportunity to succeed. Equality of opportunity is based not on someone's ethnicity, age, gender, or class. It's based on their humanity. We'll summarize equality of opportunity in one word: freedom. To seek equality of outcome is to manipulate the opportunity of different individuals based on their group identity in an attempt to make the outcome of their groups the same as the outcome of other groups. This is identity politics, giving different policies to different people based on their ethnicity, age, gender, class, etc. We will summarize equality of outcome in one word: equity. So freedom is the pursuit of equal opportunity. It is based on the individual. Equity is the pursuit of equal outcomes. It is based on the group. And if you can see the video, I'm giving an open hand on this side as the freedom and a closed fist on this side as equity. So though it's rational to break down the world into individuals or into groups, these two narratives are opposed to one another, and it's necessary to choose which narrative will be held in highest regard, whether we will primarily view people as individuals or as group members. It's either the group that is sovereign or it's the individual that's sovereign. Freedom and equity are mutually exclusive. Again, freedom and equity are mutually exclusive. So in regards to society today, the world is not perfect. There are infinite problems to solve, and any time that multiple people try to solve a problem, some will be better than others. This is not the fault of the man who fails to solve the problem, nor the man who solves it successfully. Distribution of ability is a universal law that all of nature and humanity has followed since the beginning. Within nature, for example, some trees are better at growing taller and stealing all the sunlight from other trees, leaving them to die without nutrient. A pack of wolves only succeeds if it follows the lead of the strongest, smartest, and most reciprocal wolf. This means that there will always be a pyramid of ability, a hierarchy, with one entity at the top of any one discipline. This is the case with mankind. This is a harsh reality. This means that unless we equalize each person's IQ, personality, history, genetics, and an infinite more classifications, we do not have control over the process of who succeeds and who doesn't. Unless we become as God to humanity, we are left with the problem of the inevitability of hierarchies. Equity is truly impossible. Now, as a note, one great solution that humans have is to create more hierarchies. And we do. We have a near infinite number of hierarchies. We all fail at almost all hierarchies, but we have created so many that almost all of us can find meaning in ascending the ladder of some other hierarchies. My disappointment in being unable to win at one game can be replaced with the meaning I find in playing another game. An artist doesn't need to be concerned with how they do on the hierarchy of professional sports and vice versa. This is uniquely human. But still, the problem remains. In every hierarchy, some people succeed and others don't. This is still a problem. I'm not defending this problem. I am just recognizing its existence. And with this problem, we must choose between our two narratives. Give each individual the fair opportunity to rise up the ladder, or give everybody or keep everybody on the same rung. Freedom or equity. In the economic hierarchy, for example, The outcome of freedom is that a rising tide lifts all ships. As the disparity between the successful and the unsuccessful grows, the overall well-being of all parties involved is increased. This is astonishingly apparent in the recent alleviation of poverty in third world countries in correlation with their adoption of free market economic policies. In these countries, 250,000 people every single day escape poverty, a reality that is absent from popular conversation but should be front page news every day. The outcome of equity is famine. The only way to keep every member on the same level is to suppress those who would have otherwise moved up the hierarchy. And every suppression of an individual means a limitation on the overall production in that society. This cycle has spiraled into death and destruction every time it's been widely implemented in economic policy. The committed pursuit of equity is what led the Soviet Union to shut down the so-called successful and oppressive Ukrainian farmers in the 1930s, leading to the starvation of over 6 million human beings. But in Western culture today, postmodern as we have become, we have convinced ourselves that this brute, universal reality of hierarchies is somehow our own fault. We link the disparity between individuals to human moral failure. This is a very self-aggrandizing ideology, and it has possessed the West for generations. We need to get out of this trap. It is a lie, a facade of pride in a world that demands our humility. It is, at root, the Tower of Babel, a claim to godhood. This lie has the ability to destroy us as it has destroyed societies in the past. But the reality of hierarchies will not change, so we must reject the lie. Instead, this humanist pride is evident in our society today, in our insistence that disparities between groups must be due to group discrimination. Popular ideas such as white privilege, toxic masculinity, or affirmative action are some of the most recent ways we tie unequitable outcomes to human moral failure. The popular worldview is to break down the world into nothing but a struggle between groups of power, and then blame the group in supposed power for their position, a deceptive mixture of postmodernism and Marxism. In fact, in many minds, it has become an axiomatic religious belief structure. Rationality is not the foundation of such a structure. Rather, I've come to believe that these ideas are much more biological and psychological in their foundation: the need for redemption for one's own wrongdoing, the need for an enemy, the need for a sense of communal purpose, the desire for creature comfort. When the real solutions to these needs is too difficult, we opt for the more immediate and expedient solution. We become tribal. We say this group is different than that group because they look different, and that's as deep as the analysis goes. We don't need to perceive the individuals in these groups based on more influential forces like their individual life circumstances, their IQ, or their personality, things that actually predict success in our modern hierarchies. We just group them by how they look. For example, a common way to classify someone would be to call them an old white man, gender, age, and race. Any negative connotations to such a classification is literally sexist, ageist, and racist. Now, it's true that humans tend towards grouping things primarily by sight, given the connection between the eyes and the central nervous system. But in matters of social consideration, grouping people primarily by how they look is itself so tribal, so absurd, so pathological that the only proper response to this way of grouping people is an appalled rejection. But Western society has not rejected these tribal tendencies. We've embraced them. We've lulled ourselves into this guilt-tripped lie. Tribalism is a lie. Equity is a lie. And we desperately need to get out of these lies. And here's why. Because these lies make us all suffer. Not only do we suffer, but those at the bottom suffer most of all. And suffering happens on the level of the individual. This is part of the problem with characterizing people by their group. It's not the group that suffers. A group is just a theoretical classification. Suffering is always upon the individual. It is critical to understand individual sovereignty in order to decrease the suffering of life. Tribalism, identity politics, intersectionality, equity, these are lies, and these lies keep us from moving forward through the suffering. What kind of heavenly world could we be if we weren't so deceived by these lies? How much death and destruction could be avoided? If we had rejected these lies 100 years ago, we could have avoided the brutal deaths of hundreds of millions who died at the hand of identity politics. The lie that group disparities are due to one evil group reigning corrupt power over another group has always been accompanied by famine and genocide. Not only that, when we remove the freedom of every man to pursue his own success, we limit him. For every great entrepreneur that we shut down because we consider his success to be an immorality, somebody in the world suffers. For every substance addict who should have been a useful member of working society, the total suffering in the world increases. We are beings bound by finitude, working in this world with limited ability and limited resources. Every extra human hour spent aimlessly is stolen from the suffering future, which demanded that hour be spent taking responsibility for the finite world, taking responsibility for the suffering. If we continue down this path of group identity, group guilt, tribalism, and the pursuit of equity, we and our children will be met with death and suffering. If we can value all people as free and equal, to love our neighbors as ourselves, then we can move forward as individuals and eliminate much of the suffering that plagues us. Perhaps we can all find meaning in that. That's it.
Wow. Well done, dude. First off, incredible writing skills you just showed off right there. That's your second draft. That's pretty impressive. I like that a lot, man. Wow. You covered a lot of ground, so it's hard to know exactly where to start in responding. Yeah. But what are some of the foundational ideas in there that you were hoping to discuss more?
Yeah, that's kind of the issue with any of this stuff, but especially the ideas of individuality versus group identity.
Yeah.
The issue is it's just this messy mixture of so many wires crossed. And that's why even writing it, that's the feeling I had so often was like, man, I'm getting into like so many different, like dropping into so many different little baskets of like issues that take so much to understand. And so it was like, okay, how can I summarize that in one sentence? I think the main thing that I feel like in writing that, as I've been working on it, the main thing I feel like that I'm trying to get across is just that there are principles that need to be avoided. And I think there are principles other than, there are principles of the past that we've seen that are so destructive that we've learned to avoid them. Anything coming out of the mouth of like Hitler, we look back to our conversation about Hitler. We look back and we reject it. We know that it's wrong. We know that we need to reject, calling a certain group of people inferior. And so I think that's partly, it's almost like when people have gone too far in their racism and in their like blatant racism, blatant group identity stuff, like what Hitler did in Nazi Germany, that is clear to us now, but it's not clear for some reason that we just shouldn't see things as group dynamics at all. So all that I feel like I'm trying to get across in this, the main thing I feel like I'm getting across is like, hold on, these ideas are really sketchy. We can't push these ideas forward. And the only ones that I specifically called out, I think that's something that we could talk about is specific ideas in society today. But the ones I specifically called out were just, representative, white privilege, affirmative action, toxic masculinity.
Yeah, those are great examples. Then they get into kind of the heart of the issue. I have been so uncomfortable recently whenever I hear people talking about white privilege, because I know how sketchy of a road it is to go down. And it's not because there's no reality behind the history of what people point to. So obviously, as far as it goes in American history, yeah, there absolutely has been a privilege to being white in America for most of the history of the country. That's undeniable and true. But to continue now when we are, I mean, I would argue closer to an equal and free and non-discriminatory culture as anybody in the world right now.
Yeah.
It's crazy to bring that front and center and be, it feels like whenever somebody brings that up, it's like, hey, no, we still need to talk about this as though it's the biggest way that we should view each other, and the lens with which we should interpret everything that's happening economically, politically, even religiously sometimes.
Yeah.
And I'm just not on board with that. I am not, after seeing the last century of human history, obviously not firsthand, but understanding the last century of human history, I am very hesitant to even take a small step down that road of categorizing people primarily or only be based on, gender or ethnicity or nationality, things like that. Just really, really, it's not a good road to go down. It's an absolutely treacherous one. And to even take a first step in that direction, you need to be really careful.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said something key in there. You said there is a truth behind it. And that is, of course, that's undeniable. There is a truth behind, and I think you were mainly referring to the some of these terms being true maybe in the past or something. But it is true, but many things can be true and in opposition to each other. And so you could say that group identity, like to view things through the group lens, is true. And it is maybe in a materialist way true, but it's not as true as to see things from the lens of the individual. What I mean by that is it's not taking enough things into account. So maybe it is technically true, but it's kind of like saying, is it true that I can't really think of an example, but is it true that I can do some terrible, evil thing? It's like, yeah, that's true, but it's not true enough. It's not taking into account. So it's almost like, I guess I'm almost slipping into like pragmatism as a definition of truth. But I think the issue is like, there can be truth to it, but when it is so clear that the utility for getting out of that evil or getting out of the disparity or whatever, when it's so clear that the utility is actually in seeing things as individuals, then at a certain point you just have to give up the group identity stuff. It's the difference between, like, you can always look at life as everything is the world's problem, it's other people's problem, it's their fault, or you can look at the world as it's my fault, it's my responsibility. Both are true, but really, from a pragmatist point of view, there's only one that's true. It's only to look at things as your own fault and your own responsibility,
Yeah, definitely. And another just interesting part of this all is you can kind of take a different approach, whether you're looking at things politically or religiously or materially. There's kind of, it changes the discussion a little bit in your approach. I'll just show all my cards right at the beginning of that, though, and say that I think in every one of those categories, the right answer is to primarily view people as individuals and then recognize the reality of our different groupings around gender and different parts of our identity. But the primary aspect of someone's being is their sovereignty as an individual.
Exactly.
It's when it becomes more important than someone's actual self. I'm not just the sum of all of my identity parts. I'm actually a unique individual. And I think maybe it's another if you have something to say, I was going to take us in another direction, but if you have something else to say along those lines, go ahead.
Well, I think that is the centerpiece of the whole Judeo-Christian story is the individual. And that's something that humans discovered thousands of years ago. And the way they discovered it was Genesis 1:27. Every human is made in the image of God. Every one of us has a divine center, and each one of us needs to be valued in that way. And that's a crazy, profound idea. That's not obvious. That's not obvious to just looking at people without any presuppositions. It's not obvious, but it's necessary. We need to view things that way in order to get anywhere. And so in the Bible, it says thousands of years ago, it was written, each person is made in the image of God. We each have divinity that needs to be respected, male and female. It even had from the beginning of scripture was the idea that male and female are equal. And all of this stuff is from a secular worldview, from a, without those, those things are axioms that you can build a worldview off of. Those are at the very foundation. Those are the axioms. And from there, it's kind of like defining the rules of the game. Okay, here's the rules of chess. Now we can play chess. It's these are the axioms that we're going to develop a society off of. And then those societies succeeded. And now today, 6,000 years after that was written, we are not recognizing those axioms as true. We honestly, in Western culture, I would say the main way that people view other people is by their group identity. It's so common and so prevalent in our society today. And I think that's just so dangerous. These are ideas that were discovered so long ago. And everything we've built was on the axiom of the individual is the where my consciousness ends. That is where that is what needs to be considered, is one person versus another person. And there's no way that you could account for all of the groups that I might belong to,
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I was going to say earlier, is that when you break down, you're talking in your writing, in your essay or whatever you're calling it, you're drawing the distinction. I remember you clearly wrote in there that equity and freedom are mutually exclusive.
Right.
And you got to really stop and think where those different sides come from, and what worldview those come from, what belief system. Like you're saying, there are some axiomatic ideas that you find at the root system of a lot of these ideologies, philosophies, worldviews. And so when you break it down, where does this idea come from that the individual is the primary way that everyone needs to be seen? And you mentioned the Bible. Even in the Bible, there are still different groups of people. And we could get into that maybe too, talking about the Israelites, how God did choose a people in the Old Testament. And this is a part of the story of humanity, that even in God's interaction with humanity, he did even separate by groups at one point. But if you take it all the way back to the beginning and the intention of creation, he's laying this foundational truth. I mean, it's one of the first things written down in the Bible that God says. It's male I guess it's not quoting God. It's just the account of creation. He's saying that mankind was made in the image of God, and they're made male and female. And there you have it. So we're men and women, all created in the image of God. And that piece inside of us, that bearing the image of God, is what gives us each, an intrinsic and unmeasurable value as individuals.
Yeah, totally. I don't know. I feel like it's a theological as well as a historical question about the Israelites being chosen. There's definitely a lot of instances of God going outside of that, pursuing Gentiles, pursuing Rahab and individuals for who they were as individuals. I don't know if I definitely don't feel comfortable with the idea that God chose the group of Israelites based on their ethnicity or based on whatever. I think my vague interpretation would be something more along the lines of these were the people who adopted the proper modes of being. These are the people who had the idea of the individual. They had the idea of creation. They had the right story, and they were progressing. And that the Old Testament was kind of like the account of that group. And in a lot of ways, that group was specifically chosen by God. But I'm definitely not comfortable with the idea that there were human beings outside of the Israelites who were just like icons that weren't part of God's story or something like that.
Yeah. Well, and the purpose too, when you take a broad look at scripture, when you first see it, I mean, if you just flip open to First or Second Kings or or First, Second Samuel, you might be really confused in trying to understand God's intent in working through the Israelites. And it's important to remember, I think, like you're saying, Ruth comes to my mind as one of the primary examples of this, God going outside of his chosen people, the Israelites, and you still do see his value for people because they're people. It's not like he just chose the Israelites and nobody else mattered through the entire Old Testament until Jesus. That's definitely not the correct interpretation of the overarching story, but God's actual intent in choosing and separating that group of people for himself, or I guess he wasn't the one that necessarily separated them, but they grew into a nation out of the line of Abraham. And he called them to be a nation set apart for himself. But the reason he was doing that, so when God is the one even, operating in distinguishing groups between one another, he's using that one group of people to be a blessing to all of the rest of the earth. It's inclusive to everyone. So even then, it's not saying, it's not at all the same as what we tend to do as humans, which is to divide ourselves into groups either by nationality or ethnicity. Those are the primary two, or you could say by gender. And I guess now sexual orientation is kind of another one that in very recent history has, we actually refer to those as communities, like real groups. But what we tend to do is just say, hey, I'm a part of this one and I like myself better than everybody else. And so this group must be better than all the rest of them. And we're going to dominate in some way, or we're going to exalt ourselves or raise ourselves above all these other ones. And so it's totally opposite of God's heart in even behind operating in that mentality of thinking about people as part of a group. It's the intent in God's heart is to work through that group of people to be a blessing to everyone. And I think that's still true today. I would say that God's intent with choosing the Israelites could be the same as his intent for every nation of the earth today. I think that he has a special plan and purpose for every single country that exists. And I think that there's a way that country, that culture can work to be a blessing and to be a good thing in the world, and not to exalt itself above another one, but to, same as we do on the individual level, take the heart of a servant and the posture of love and operate within God's intent for creation.
Yeah, that's interesting. Without auguring in, I think this kind of defines maybe a slight difference in worldview between you and I that I don't know if we've discovered before now, but I think that I totally agree with you with that, the second part of what you're saying, that the way God views all of humanity today is a pursuit of every individual. But in regards to the Old Testament, in regards to the Jews and stuff like that, I don't see it like, maybe I just don't see it as literally as the text was written at the time. And I think maybe that's where things diverge between you and I, is maybe I take things slightly less literally than you, and probably than most believers, where I look at that and I think this is the account of one group of people and their interaction with God. And it's the account of all of their interactions with him from their story of creation and they're stories of the flood. They're stories of Moses coming down from the mountain and establishing the law. And then this group of people operates in a world that was spread into like many different groups by ethnicity, by like in every way. There was no real crossing of one group to the next. And it was such a tribal world back then. And this one tribe, so to speak, started to adopt the correct ideas, and they started to interact with God. And as they did, they kept track of it. And that's what the Old Testament kind of developed into, was more of like their side of the story. But in my mind, if I think back to 4,000 years ago, some, Philistine that really in the biblical story is literally just an icon who gets showed up, who shows up for a second just to get like slain in a field somewhere. In my mind, in the world that I see God wanting a relationship, or God valuing that individual as highly as he valued any other individual. And that's by his own rules, the rules that he gave from the beginning. And so in my mind, any tribal tendencies, even tribal tendencies of the Jewish people, was a deviation from his way. And then in my mind, Jesus was God coming back to the earth and being like, hold on, we need to update this system. Like, you figured a lot out, but we need a big update here. It's not just this group, it's everybody. And then he lived that out in the dying for all of humanity and for the sins of every individual, right?
Yeah. But Jesus also said that he came for the Jews, and he came specifically to minister to the Jews. And he even, there's the story of the lady who comes up to him. I forget where she's from, but she's not Jewish. And she comes up and says, I think she's asking him for healing. And Jesus healed how many people physically during his ministry? And so it's, that's what he was all about. He was doing that right and left. But this lady came up and he was like basically saying, well, like, I was sent here for the Jews. I was sent here for the house of Israel. And she's like, yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the scraps from the master's table, or something like that. I'm not getting the story exactly right. And then through that, her faith breaks through that moment, and he extends the grace to her to also minister to her. But in that story, you really clearly see, it's kind of an example, I guess, depending how you look at it, for either one of what we're saying. It is a reminder that Jesus' heart, and by extension, God's heart, is for all people. And he, the master plan is the redemption of all of creation from Genesis and the fall, to fully redeeming everything, which includes all people. But Jesus did come with a specific calling and ministered almost exclusively to Jews. And then he, after his ministry is when things started to expand out, and Gentiles began to become believers as well. Mm-hmm. But I think it is something to wrestle with, and it's not very comfortable. I think it's one of the most common difficulties people have in reading all of the Old Testament, is it does seem like people show up. We talk about David and Goliath, and everybody is like, yeah, David like killed the giant Goliath, but Goliath was a real person. For what we know, I don't think he was like some, I don't know, like, other than human being. I think he was just a really big human being. And so was he not also created in the image of God, carrying the same value? To me, the answer is yes. But at that time in history, I don't know exactly what it is. If people just weren't, if we as a human species, the one human race altogether, thinking about it that way, just weren't capable of, being where God wanted us to be, or is it that, the master plan was salvation and redemption for everyone, but at that time, it just couldn't be that way, or at that time it wasn't, like, the plan wasn't happening instantaneously. The plan was unfolding over centuries, and it's a different time. Yeah, it's something to wrestle with for sure.
Yeah, exactly. It's something to wrestle with. It's something for anybody who takes scripture seriously to try and sort out for themselves. But yeah, I would say, given this conversation, just the things you've said, we just don't I don't see things nearly that literally. Like I don't even read the scripture of Jesus saying that and think, oh, that must mean that there's this separation of groups. Like I just think like I already kind of said, I think that the Old Testament story is it's kind of like the record of this one people group and their interaction with God. And to them, Goliath wasn't a human. Goliath was the enemy. And that's the way the story's written.
Yeah.
And there's tons of value in it. But I don't see it as I don't see it like things were based on groups back then and things are not based on groups today. I think things should have always been based on the individual. It just took us a while to catch up. And I think Jesus was super clear about updating that system. All of that to say, I do not discount the fact that there was something special about the Jewish people, and the fact that Jesus was a Jew. Like, Christians don't really think of that very often. I don't think of that. I never grew up like hearing that or really realizing that, but his whole life, he was a full-on 100% Orthodox Jew. He was more Jewish than anybody who lives today. Like, historically and traditionally, he was a full-on ethnic and religious Jew who then expanded the belief system that he was born into. He expanded that by his own death to all people, which developed into Christianity as it is today. So I definitely there's something special about that. I just don't take it nearly as literally, I would say, as most believers classically have taken it.
Yeah. Yeah. And as with most things in scripture and in the Christian faith, I feel like it comes down to, we're not spoon fed the exact right answers to everything. We're constantly put in this place of seeing truths that seem to be conflicting, and we're right in the middle of them, and we have to wrestle with them to figure out what's really going on. And very interesting that there is a literal wrestle between Jacob and an angel of the Lord.
Israel means
supposedly Jesus before he was incarnated, some people believe. And that's how he got his name. Jacob went from being called Jacob to being called Israel. And so the namesake of the people of God is to wrestle with him. And I think that's so profound. And so when it comes to something like this, sorting out these questions, I think we have to get as close as we possibly can, but also know that we've never fully figured out a specific topic in scripture. And so it's the continual, we think we know, but we also know that perfection is only going to be revealed by Jesus in the fullness of his kingdom. And he's coming back to complete that work. And so it's our job now to be in that wrestle, just as it has been ever since Jacob became Israel, by wrestling with the angel of the Lord.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree with that. I think that's exactly what this podcast is for. And it's not even about when do we finally cross the threshold of boom, now we're in perfection. To me, the process is the wrestling is what is so valuable. That wrestling, that's exactly that is why the Jewish people succeeded. That is why Israel succeeded, is because it was the group who wrestled with God. It was the group who wrestled with these things, the group who cared so much about these things, who were, they maybe had other things that they could have been dealing with, the starvation and trying to develop technology and all the crazy things that the whole world was trying to develop. But to them, they were wrestling with God all through it all. And they were even keeping track of it in written form from day to day, from leader to leader. And their story was the story of our relationship with the transcendent, our relationship with God. And it was this wrestle in between the two. It wasn't even just submitting to him. It was wrestling with him and viewing for Israelites to view themselves as somebody who could wrestle with God, somebody who could not as a equal necessarily, but as there is this divinity inside of us. There's this God image that has been put inside of us. And it's, and that's the reason that they succeed. And that's exactly why it's so crucial to continue to wrestle. It's that is what matters. It's the wrestling of it that gets us up, and that gets us to the world that we have today. Pull someone out of that society of David and Goliath and put them in the world today, they would just think they were in heaven. They would be like, oh, wow, okay, like we're in perfection now. Like everything is so incredibly easy. And like, I don't even have to, I can't even begin to imagine how different the world would have been. Like I can literally just turn this knob of like rock and out comes water and it's clean. And, you know, just all of the ways that our world has become so easy and amazing. Like the human condition, unfortunately, hasn't really improved. The human morality hasn't improved nearly as quickly as our technology. But like what I'm trying to say is the wrestling with God is what's gotten us from terrible death and suffering and everybody dying before the age of 30 and just brutal humanity to what we have today, which is so simple and easy that we can sit here having this conversation across the world from each other.
Yeah. I think a key consideration in this whole question, and we can, after this, let's get back to more of how this applies today, but this is good. I like that we're talking about all this. I think a key consideration is to ask the question, who's initiating the process? Or, you know, so I guess what I'm trying to say is, did the Israelites become the Israelites because of their own initiative? And they were the Israelites, they were the chosen people, they were the people who wrestled with God just because they decided to take on that position. They decided to be the ones who cared more about morality and understanding truth. And so they went into that wrestle voluntarily. Or did God initiate that process of them becoming the people of God? And he say, hey, Abraham, you are going to be the father of many nations and your descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars. And, you know, I have this plan for you. So you go to this place and you're going to grow into this nation. And so, yeah, what I'm getting at is, to me, I still see God as the initiator behind that, because he told Abraham before there was any actual people group, he just told Abraham, hey, go be an immigrant and, you know, leave the land of your father and mother and go on a journey to this other place. And I'm gonna make your descendants so numerous as the stars, and they're gonna be my people, and I have a plan for them. And so that's where I see the difference of, I see God initiating it and him calling the Israelites to be the Israelites all the way back before they even existed, starting with Abraham.
Totally. And I agree with that. The very initial point was coming from God, in the same way that everything is initiated by God, in the same way that the world was initiated by God. But even in that story of Abraham, it was initiated by God's invitation, but it was an invitation, and it was contingent on his free will. It was contingent on him taking up that call. And he was old. He had every reason not to, and he chose to. I'm not close to the idea that same option was open to someone else who wasn't Abraham, but they didn't take up the call. You know?
Or if Abraham said, nah, that God would have chosen someone else.
Exactly. And I think there's plenty of that kind of stuff happening throughout scripture, that yes, it is God as the initiator, but we are involved in writing the story as well, which is, and I think that's exactly the right way to view life, is that it like, we are not the creator. We are not the God. We are not the one who determines everything ourselves, but things are determined through us. And we are almost like we have veto power. That's what I'm trying to get at. We have veto power on some of God's plans. Exactly. That's exactly what I'm trying to get across, is like, we have our free will. And so God has plans. Maybe sometimes he doesn't always get what he wants. Obviously he doesn't. The world's not perfect. There's a lot of evil in the world, a lot of evil based on human free will. So I feel like we landed in a decent place.
Well, so I think where we ended was the truth of the sovereignty of God and the truth of humanity's free will. And sometimes those feel like very conflicting realities, but they're actually intertwined and complementary truths that are sometimes really impossible to fully distinguish. But they're both true, and we live right in the middle of both of them.
Yeah. You can't fully deny one or the other, and either one or the other is taken to its like final analysis is nonsensical in a way, given our world. But the best way to view things is exactly what you're saying, like a mixture. It's to see that there is God's determining power, but there is our will to change things. I mean this both in the literal way of God as a literal metaphysical being, but also in just the metaphorical way of that's the best way to view things. Like the structure of reality has its own determined course, but we also can play our part in that course and we can change it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and that's, so I think the natural progression then is to, you were talking about the sovereignty of God and the free will of man. I think that ties in so directly to where we started in the sovereignty of the individual, because at the end of the day, we make choices as individuals. And like you're making the point about Abraham, he had a real choice in front of him, and he could have said no. He could have turned that down. He could have said, no, I'm just going to stay here and kind of live out my days. And, and that's going to be that. And it would have changed the course of history 100%. It would have. So even that story is another example of the sovereignty of the individual. And I think a huge part of that is freedom of choice, free will. And so that's something that gets taken away when you view someone primarily by a piece of their identity and group them into a certain specific category, and then that defines them, rather than them having that divine spark at the center of them, the image of God that they're bearing, which gives them the right to actually have freedom of choice, freedom of opportunity. And so that's where this idea comes from. And as a Christian, that's why I'm so passionate about the protection of the freedom of opportunity, and real freedom of choice.
Right. Yeah. And in kind of this group versus individual paradigm, I think you and I probably both strongly fall on the side of we need to, as I wrote, like in what I wrote, like I came very hard on the side of we need to view the world as individuals. As soon as we deviate from, like, the individual has to be paramount. The minute that we deviate from that, the minute that we put group identity over individual identity, that to me is where that is like red flag, in the same way that calling a group inferior is a red flag. To me, anytime that you see things that way, it's fundamentally, it is racist, or it is sexist, or whichever way you break things down. So I think, and then, like getting into those ideas in history in the last 100 years, there is such direct correlation, just like what I wrote, like there's such direct correlation to those who viewed things as individuals and their success versus those who viewed things as groups and their failure. But today, people don't even really know the history of that. People don't even, how many people would know what happened in the Soviet Union? How many Westerners would recognize the name Mao Zedong? Like maybe 10%, maybe less.
Young that's people, so scary. That's a scary low percentage.
Yeah, he's still highly regarded in China. Well, estimates vary so much. Solzhenitsyn estimated that he was the cause of 100 million deaths. So nearly as many as all the people who died throughout all of World War II. Many times more than how many people Hitler actually killed in genocide. But everybody knows the story of Hitler, and they should. Who knows the story of Mao? Who knows the story of Stalin? Who knows the story of Pol Pot? I didn't grow up. I'm pretty sure the first I heard of Pol Pot was like you telling me when you were overseas, sending me messages about it.
Yeah, probably, because that's when I learned about him. I think in some of our research before going to Cambodia, but then being there and, seeing horrific leftovers of what happened there and hearing stories from the locals and some American expats who now live there. It's just mind-boggling things. And I mean, if you bring up Pol Pot, he's like,
Mhm.
I mean, just take him alone, and that's an absolutely horrific piece of history, but he pales in comparison to Mao Zedong. He pales
Mhm.
in comparison to Stalin. And so, I mean, I know we talked about doing a deep dive on the darkness of the 1900s. And
Yeah.
as we're talking about this, I'm just realizing how key it is that we do that. I think even just for our own sake of
Right.
taking another look and seeing it all together. I mean, we don't talk about this so much as though we just came through this horrible period in history, but we did. There was
Yeah.
so much darkness, so much suffering, so much death, and it's so recent. I mean, I told you this the other day, but it was striking me so freshly as I was driving home from jiu-jitsu the other day in the car, and I was just thinking, man, all four, I think my grandma might be a little bit younger. I think that all four of my grandparents were alive during World War II. I think all four of my grandparents were alive here in America as Hitler's genocide, the Holocaust, was going on.
Yeah. It just happened.
It just happened. And it's yeah. Anyway, I just am kind of
Yeah, it just happened, and there's lessons that are necessary, not optional. There's not like good lessons that you should learn. There's lessons in the last 100 years that are necessary for every citizen of the world today. And I think that it's kind of the same with reading. It's like there's some books that are, they're good reading and they have great lessons in them. And then there are books that are necessary reading.
Yeah.
And there are books that you cannot function in society without understanding this base level of things that barely anybody understands today. And if we did understand, if we all had the Gulag Archipelago in common, if every person in the West had that story in common, if we all understood what happened in the gulags, if we all understood Alexander Solzhenitsyn's life of traveling through, first fighting the war, and then when he came back, he should have been honored with like a hero's welcome after risking his life and being in a prison of war. He gets back to Russia, and they put him straight into a camp because he's been in a prison of war. He's probably been westernized, and from there he's put into gulags, and he just witnesses death after death after death, and he sees the destruction of everything based on group identity, based on, and that's the second part of my little essay, whatever thing, is based on the equivalence between group disparity and moral failure. That's where things went so evil and so dark, was saying, okay, if you're in power, it must mean that you're evil. If you are a rich, so-called rich farmer, which meant that you probably had like 2 horses or something, like you were still basically in complete poverty. But if you were considered to be one of the rich farmers, then it was like, okay, you're the evil oppressor. You're the bad group because of the way that you've suppressed us. And so off to the gulags with them, right? And what did that lead to? More death, more destruction. But it's like, if our society had one man's journey through the gulags in our collective memory, things would be in such better shape than they would be. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why this conversation today is so crucial, is that, as we're talking about this darkness of the last century, so much of it came because of drawing distinctions between groups. And whether you wanted to, maybe we haven't even mentioned anything that happened on the continent of Africa yet. There's a whole nother set of crazy things that went on there. But so much of the human suffering in the last century has come from drawing these distinctions between groups and elevating them above each other, and making policies differently for different ones of them. And so it's like there's this historical just like siren going off. There's it's just waiting for this lesson to be learned for us as a human race. It's just saying like, hey, stop doing this. Like, don't just no more of this. Like, that's enough. Like, we've had enough of distinguishing between people's, primarily grouping people into categories because of their nationality, ethnicity, gender, because of their identity, and treating them differently or believing differently about them. No, every single individual is valuable, no matter what you look like, no matter what gender you're born with, no matter anything about you. You are intrinsically and eternally valuable as an individual human being. And we need to start shaping it's not start. We need to keep on.
We need to remember.
We need to remember where we've come in Western society, and why we in America, Canada, these places, why we didn't have these things happen in the last century. And, I can already hear I feel like I have all these Facebook comments ringing in my ears of people, talking about the things that are wrong right now. And in everything I just said, I'm not saying that America's perfect. I'm not saying that Western civilization as a whole is perfect, or but I do think that the ideologies, the philosophies are the best. And so as true as we can be to those, and moving even further towards those truths than we've ever been so far, is the right way to go. It's not to say, hey, things feel still not perfect in Western societies, and so let's have another shot at the things that wrought total destruction on humanity in the last century. Yeah.
And it's not even like, of course things aren't perfect. We're in a broken world. That's just like, we all die. It's finite. This is what we talk about. This is what I talk about all the time. It's like, of course things aren't perfect, but if you're going to call it imperfect, compared to what? Compared to what civilization? Compared to who in history? Who has ever had the kind of equality? Who has ever had the kind of like good outcomes? If you're concerned about outcomes, who has gotten there? It's been the people based on this idea, the idea that every man is equal. And so, I totally agree. Of course, many people have missed the mark. And this is what we were talking about in one of our other podcasts, was the Declaration of Independence. The ideas in there, maybe they could be written better, but they are pretty close to perfect. And I would say that's because they're in alignment with reality. The reality is that we do each have a divine center in all of us. And so the Declaration, even the guys who wrote it didn't live up to it. Even, everybody in the world has taken a long time to get closer to realizing those foundational ideals, but the way that they wrote it was brilliant. And the reason that, like, the fact that we are in such an equal society, in such a fair, in such a prosperous society where we all live long, like generally extremely easy lives. The reason that if you look at a graph of, economic economic GDP of any kind of economic graph of how we've been doing as humans, you would see we're all at nothing for basically forever. And then about 130, 140 years ago, we start to climb. And the reason that we climb to this insane height of, like, I think I already mentioned in one of the other podcasts, like 130 years ago, the average Westerner lived on $2 a day. Today, it's like we're all like the poverty line of the world is, we consider that the poverty line is below $2 a day, and almost nobody in the world is at that point. Like back then, that was the average of the West. And now it's like almost the only people in the world who are in that state is very corrupt communist states, really. So it's like, yes, it's imperfect. Of course it's imperfect, but the ideals that have moved us forward are to view people as individuals. The ideals are written in the Declaration of Independence. They are, all men should be considered equal. All men are created equal. The only issue with that is they just considered that to be self-evident. And that's what they wrote. And maybe it was self-evident in a very Christian society like there was in the West in 1776.
Well, I think what it really means is that it felt self-evident. I think to them, what it really means is that to them, it seemed so obvious that you had to admit it. That it's like, okay, we can look how true these things are. Like,
Right.
let's all agree that those things are true because they're obviously so true. And they're ultimately, sorry to just cut you off, but they're ultimately
Totally.
not self-evident. I mean, clearly, because so much of the world is still not based on those ideals.
Right.
They're actual essential and incredibly life-giving truths that are, it's amazing that they've been discovered and written down and understood and lived by, more and more closely as we've gone on in history. But anyway, yeah, not self-evident,
exactly.
but definitely essential.
I would say they are self-evident to the human soul. I would say every person, and so maybe that's what they're tapping into, is like anybody in the reality of their own being has to admit that they have this, like, the best way to define what's really in us is like this divinity. And the best way to explain one person to another person is to call them equal. Maybe, I don't know, maybe that is actually self-evident in our soul, but it definitely is not self-evident in our rationality, in our front brain, the recent ways that we've developed science and our philosophy and stuff. It's not self-evident. There's nothing self-evident to just pure rationality. Everything that Hitler and Stalin did, they broke it down perfectly rationally. To them, it was perfectly rational. To them, it was true. And that to me is like, well, maybe rationality isn't the best way to break down everything in the world. Sure, maybe it's perfectly rational. I heard this example once. It's a perfectly scientific endeavor to mix Ebola with smallpox. Ebola, extremely deadly. Smallpox, extremely contagious. If you were to mix the two, that would likely mean the end of humanity. It's a perfectly scientific and rational endeavor to do so. It would be true if you found out how to mix those two. That would be, you would have a type of literal truth right there. It'd be like, yeah, it's true. You can mix this element with that element, and truthfully, they come together. And this is back to the pragmatism that I was talking about before. It's like, sure, that's technically true. It's not true enough. It's not taking into consideration all of the suffering that's going to happen. It's not taking into consideration all of the death and destruction. It's not taking into consideration the morality.
Well, yeah, because it's true, but it's not right in my view, and anybody who's honest, their view too. Yeah, and maybe even as I'm saying that, I'm saying everybody who's honest, like, I guess I am coming back to, same as the founding fathers saying, no, that actually is self-evident. Like that It's very obvious that that's not a good thing. If you just think that mixing Ebola with smallpox and ending humanity would just, it's like, oh, well, yeah, it's true that it would do that. So let's go for it. It's true that would probably mean that, but it's not right that you would do something like that. So
what's that rightness based in? You're saying it's not right. So you are appealing to a higher source of morality. So according to you, you have that source, and that is the Bible, that is God. But to somebody who doesn't believe that, then they wouldn't be able to, they wouldn't be able to follow that, would they?
Yeah. Well, and that's why it's not ultimately, I don't know. It's in one way it feels self-evident, and on the other hand, it's like you were saying, it's not completely self-evident, or we would all just live that way.
Right.
So the morality, the moral standard does seem universally self-evident in some ways. But then in other ways, the morality between societies ends up in such a different way that it's, I don't know, it's like it is self-evident, but it's also not so self-evident that everyone just gets it. It's like there's this room for interpretation where a lot of people end up getting it wrong.
Yeah, I feel like I'm almost wanted to backtrack a little bit of what I've been saying, because I'm thinking, hold on. Like, as you were just saying that, I was just thinking like, hold on. We are talking like this is self-evident. The only reason we're saying that is because we live in thousands of years of Judeo-Christian history that has come to our like wide cultures that have taught us from birth this philosophy of Christianity, really, of valuing the individual, that to us it is self-evident, but it's not self-evident. Something Ravi Zacharias said brilliantly. He was like, Morality doesn't span across the whole world. One country loves thy neighbor, the other country eats thy neighbor. And I think the fact that morality has not been universal at all, and it could not be less universal, like I would say a lot of people in human history could drop into this conversation and they would say mixing Ebola with smallpox, like why not? Why not do that? Or they might say, I guess that's a bit of an extreme example, but they might say like, why do you have to view people equally? That's ridiculous. Of course, some people are above others. Like that one's strong. Of course, he's better than the one who's weak. And they would almost have more of a rational point from a secular point of view. And so that just takes me back to what I said about the Declaration of Independence. Like, yeah, it is self-evident in a Judeo-Christian religion, but as soon as God is dead, as Nietzsche said, 70 years later, as soon as God is dead, then we don't have those same axioms to rest on. And all of the death and destruction that came from that death of that religion is exactly what happened. And then here we are in 2020, and we can look back to that and we choose not to. We choose not to see those lessons of the past. And we are still in this crazy group identity crap.
Yeah. And that comes a little bit back into what you mentioned in your writing about hierarchies. There is something that doesn't seem right about that. And on the surface level, I think we can all relate to that at one time or another in our lives, where we feel like we're not as good at something, or something just doesn't come as naturally in school or in sports or in life, or you're feeling as an adult, like, oh, well, wealth just didn't just fall into my lap, and from my friend over here it did. And it's, it doesn't feel fair because the outcomes are different. But the question is that feeling of, oh, that doesn't feel fully right, based on an actual moral argument on the real world, or is it just how you feel?
Yeah, which is interesting. For some reason, we do have this feeling of things should be perfect and equal and everything, but the world has never been like that in any way. And even as you were saying that, I was thinking, sure, one person might think this isn't fair, but that's just the wrong way of viewing things. For example, imagine somebody who is in the Western world today. Imagine someone in North Dakota. They're really poor. Say they're homeless. Say they're living on the streets, and they just, they have to eat at like a homeless shelter, and they sleep in a homeless shelter, and they just get like soup every day. To him, that's like the bottom of society. And maybe he's there because he thinks the world's against him. Maybe he's there, he thinks it's because of racism. And he thinks, other races have put me down here. Or maybe it's a woman and she thinks it's because men have put me down here. And look at how men are more, are so dominant, and that one guy in my life put me here, and whatever. It's just the wrong way of viewing things. And even breaking it down to materialist, to a breakdown of just materialism, that guy is infinitely more wealthy and well off than anybody in human history ever was. Yeah. The people at bottom of society today live at a much higher living standards than kings did 200 years ago, never mind 1,000 years ago. And then you take that and you never mind history. What about the whole world? Like compare somebody in the West at the very bottom of society who thinks that they've just had it out. The world has it out for them. They're at the bottom. They can't get up. You are so high above the disabled, random child born minutes before their parents died on the river in Tanzania with, no opportunity. You're like, there are people who are at zero. So you at, 10,000. Yeah, there are people above you and there are people below you. But to me, it's just like, that's just the wrong way of looking at the world. You just can't think of things that way. You have to think of things in terms of yourself, your relationship with the structure of reality, your relationship with yourself. You don't compare. Okay, like I could find so many ways in my life that I have been disadvantaged by the world. Any way that I go down that path is going to lead to my own destruction, and it's going to lead to the destruction of others. So it's totally unacceptable to me.
So say more about that. Why are you so convinced that it would inevitably lead to destruction?
Because it's historically true. Anytime that people have viewed that their group is oppressed, it's led to that kind of destruction. If you're going to say, I'm oppressed, this evil other group is lording their oppression over me, and I'm going to do something about that, I guess the options would be either I'm going to do nothing and I'm just a victim and I have no path to improve in the world, or I'm going to do something and go get revenge on those people.
Mm-hmm.
So either one of those options would kind of be like taking revenge on the structure of the world. It's like it's back to exactly what we were talking about before. It's back to Cain and Abel. It's like God and the structure of reality has done me poorly.
Mm-hmm.
My sacrifices have not been accepted. The sacrifices that I made to God were not accepted by him. And now I'm going to go take revenge. And so, Abel over there is, he's successful. God is shining down on him. And he's, maybe he's the successful civilization or whatever, in the minds of someone who's suffering. But in the story of Cain and Abel, Cain just saw that is the ideal. That is the successful one. Let me just go take revenge. And so I would say, your options are you can go take revenge and you can get rid of your ideal, which will lead to his death and destruction. And then now you have no ideal. So now you are going down a path of death and destruction. Or you can do nothing and you can be a victim and just give in. And that is because the world is suffering. The world is entropy. Things don't just get better by themselves. If you do nothing for a couple months, like if you don't even say you don't work for a couple months or you don't pay your taxes or something, it's death and suffering that comes. We need to be striving. We need to be wrestling. We need to be fighting to try and make it through this world that is suffering, this world that is beating down on us all the time. It takes so much work just to slowly work our way up. And to me, the mindset is so important to that. The mindset of I'm not a victim. I'm going to make what I can of this world. Anybody can break down the world and say 100 ways in which they're a victim, and they should, by rights, they should have many things given to them.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as you start down that path, it's death and destruction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so much of this, I think where I see this more than any other place is materially. People feel that, an unequal distribution of wealth is immoral. And so what we're talking about, this whole discussion with the sovereignty of the individual as opposed to making decisions and policies and et cetera based on group identities. Those things those things result in very different outcomes economically and also very different approaches. So as I'm kind of seeing in my mind, there's just this like sliding scale between how much you view people as an individual and how much you view them as part of a group. And I think both of us are like, put that setting 100% on the side of viewing someone as an individual. And so to me, economically, that translates to like pure capitalism, like,
total freedom in the market.
Yeah, absolutely. Free markets. On the other side of that, view people as part of a group that are either corrupt and dominating or victimized and oppressed, and them, they're in opposition to each other and they don't get along, and we need to like have policies that reconcile them somehow together. And so,
right.
Yeah.
Which is absurd. Like you can't even, that theory in and of itself, that theory eats itself because, okay, first of all, in talking about wealth distribution and stuff, I think that first, let me just establish this. You and I think, agree on this. We're not defending the hierarchy, and we are not defending, that's something I wrote in there specifically, is like, I'm not in defense of this system. I'm just recognizing that this exists. So we're not defending the fact that some people succeed and others don't. I also think it's key to point out that sometimes people do get ahead by corruption. Mm-hmm. And sometimes people do use tyranny to lord power over other people. And I think that has happened a lot in the past. And I think that there has to be recognition of that, and there has to be freedom given to all, but you can never go back and fix every mistake of the past along the way to try and make equal outcomes. It's nonsensical, and the idea eats itself. So here's what I mean by the idea eats itself. And this is what intersectionality is. I'll define very quickly as intersectionality was an idea developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, as far as I remember. And the idea is, now it's just so popular in the world today, but the idea is that your identity isn't just your group. It is the intersection of different groups. And so for me, I am a millennial. So you can break me down by my generation. Inside a millennial, you could break me down by I am 26. And then you could break me down by I have brown hair. I am a man. I have a beard. I am Caucasian. I have a status card. I am, whatever other ways. I am this level of smart. I'm this level of extremely smart. This level of extremely attractive. On and on and on, right? So her idea, so-called intersectionality, is you are the breakdown of those groups. And so for a Black person in America today, they are oppressed because they're Black. But a Black woman in America today is maybe they're oppressed twice as much because they're a woman, and women are oppressed, but they're also Black. And so there's this you are a Black woman, you have higher victimhood points compared to white man. But white man is slightly lower than Jewish man because they are slightly more successful. So her idea of intersectionality was breaking it down upon all these different groups. And the problem with that, first of all, is when you break any individual down into groups, you can find one group in which they are the oppressor. And what has been the solution to that in the past? Get rid of the oppressors. That's always been the solution. And so, yeah, we are all guilty. Hello, this is the Christian idea. They are realizing the Christian ideas. If you take their ideas to the end, you kind of hit reality, which is if you break down everybody by every single, their genetics, their history, every single little thing, you end up at the level of the individual. And so I would say intersectionality, just as we are facing it in this conversation, it's not an idea that's going to last. First of all, that's what I thought about this week when I wrote about it. It was this is an idea that's just like a snap it's just a pop in a bucket. It's gone, it'll be gone because there's no power to it, because all it is it's halfway between realizing that the group identities is nonsensical and realizing that once you break down people by all of the different groups, you just get back to the idea of the individual, which is kind of funny in the end,
Yeah. Wow, that's a really good point. I never fully thought that through. That's a good way to say that it eats itself. You can't really follow that ideology the whole way through without getting back to exactly where I would hope people end up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So what do you do with this economically? What do we, how do we approach this? I mentioned capitalism. I guess just for the sake of simplicity, let's say there's this sliding scale, just the way there is between primarily seeing people as individuals, primarily seeing people as their as part of a group, and then below that, let's just say when you translate that into different ways of analyzing society, one would be economically. So on that sliding scale, specific to economics, let's just, to be really simple, it's not quite this simple, but let's say pure capitalism over here and pure socialism over on this side. And we have this sliding scale, and we're either going to put it 100% on one side, 100% on the other side, or somewhere in between. How do you approach that? What do you think actually makes the most sense? Because I think it gets, as just a general idea, I think it's great to say, hey, for all the reasons we've already laid out so far in this podcast, we should really view people as individuals primarily. But then when it comes to economics, I don't know what to do with this, honestly, myself, because it seems like a little bit of a breakdown because I don't think that pure capitalism actually really works. And so if that sliding scale is there, I think it's actually more realistic to put it something like, 90% or 85%, pure capitalism with like some room for, it's not socialism, but some more like socialist kind of
social programs and stuff.
Right, exactly. Programs inside of a capitalist economy.
Yeah. I feel like, so here's how I would answer that. I'd say total free markets, in my opinion, total free markets and totally viewing people only by their individual life circumstances is the ideal. And so first of all, it's important that every way that we possibly can, we want to push towards that ideal. So we want to push towards more free markets. We want to push towards more seeing people as the individual. But we are in a world where things are not ideal. And so we have to make concessions on certain circumstances. For example, I don't think right now, like say in my own country, we have socialized medicine. We have healthcare for every Canadian citizen gets free healthcare, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say just because I have an ideal that healthcare wouldn't be distributed through the hands of the government, just because I have an ideal of free markets doesn't mean I think right now what we should do is just make the medical system totally free markets in Canada. I would say in every way that we can, we want to push towards that ideal. But because we're not in the ideal, like if I could structure the whole world right now, that's how I would have it. I would have it free markets, and I would have people to be taken care of by their own, like people could take care of each other, not by the force of the government gun, but people could take care of each other based on their own voluntary help and charity and churches and neighborhoods and families.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no way to get exactly from where we are here to where we are there. And so sometimes you have to make compromises. Sometimes you have to make, sometimes not, I'm not saying you need to view things in group identity, but sometimes you are going to have to, like in economic terms, going from capitalism to socialism. Sometimes you're going to have to keep things, if they're on the socialism end, keep things kind of in that realm and slowly inch it back towards more the ideal, which is free markets. I do think that total free markets work with certain restrictions, and those restrictions would be basically just what was laid out in your Declaration of Independence, the protection of life, liberty, and property. If you have those, and if those are enforced, and if those are done properly, then you can have free markets, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's really important. What we're doing right now is to take these theoretical ideas and then talk about the policy, talk about how it hits real life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. As you're talking, I was thinking, I wonder if there's going to be a new country. I wonder if, same as how America started, I don't know if it would be a colony or, I don't know exactly how it could start, but I wonder if like the new America and the new standard of freedom, I wonder if that's going to happen again. I wonder if there's going to be a country that tops the level of freedom. And
there are countries with way more economic freedom than America. Like Singapore is basically perfectly free market capitalism, and they're extremely successful for it. They have other issues, but yeah, like, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, it's good to point out that that already exists in some way. But I guess what I'm envisioning is like somehow this new nation arising, as like this baby nation in the same way that America did, and taking it even a step further with freedom and saying, having that be one of the foundational ideas from the founding of the nation, where it's like, hey, no matter what, we're never moving the sliding scale off of 100% full on capitalism. And I don't know if Singapore is exactly there or close to there. But I'm thinking of another place that, would do, I don't know, something like, I don't know, like an even more true America, I guess, when it comes to like all of personal rights and all those things, like, just
taking the America of like 1776 into 2020.
Yeah.
Because that's the way things were written at that time.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like tiny government, like hardly any taxes at all. Just like having, everything be that way. I wonder if that's going to be a next step in humanity's progression.
Yeah, maybe the country you're talking about is Mars.
Hey-oh, let's go there. Elon Musk for Mars president.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think so. We don't have much time left, but let's just keep breaking. So really what I wrote is, we need to realize that there are hierarchies. And just because there are hierarchies, we don't need to give into this crazy lie that hierarchies mean human evil and some people are evil because they are successful. That's all lies. And in the world, we can either break things into freedom or the pursuit of equity, trying to equalize all the people in a group, or members of one group to members of another group, would be equity. Or freedom, consider people as individuals, as units of free will who have the potential to do good or evil, and give them the freedom to make with their life what they want to make. And then I would say that's mainly what I wrote. And then along with that is we need to really avoid the lie of group identity in general. We need to avoid the lie that group identity, successful equals evil. And we need to avoid the lie of group identity, period. And there's a lot of suffering that's going to come if we go that way. If we consider ourselves individuals, there's a lot of goodness that could come. So that idea, I think let's just keep talking about the ways that relates to politics and that relates to policy today. Is there any other, I know you brought up economics, is there anything else you were going to say with that, or any other political realms that you were thinking?
No, I mean, economically was a big thing for me that I had on my mind, but yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It is definitely. I think that is the clearest way that it ends up showing or kind of being a revealer of what people really think and how much, where people are at on that sliding scale. But it comes through in other things as well. And you could even get into something like abortion. And I think this is relevant to that whole issue as well. A lot of people who advocate for abortion are basically comfortable with saying that, the identity of one person, being the mom, is superior to the value of another person, the baby. And, one of them, because of the group that they're in, has the ability, the authority to make a decision about whether the other person lives or dies. And that's another one that comes to mind. Trying to think through other clear examples of where it starts to break down. Even in the realm of abortion, like that, to me, I don't think that most people who would have an abortion, I don't think that they're thinking they are destroying another person and I am a superior person. They are considering that is not a person. And they're considering that, this little clump of cells inside of me, it's not a person yet. They're not rationally thinking. They're not like one of us. And in some ways that is perfectly true. But in a religious worldview, in a Christian worldview, there is also something that we have to contend with, which is this idea that the human is that any human being is divine and that they have this spark of divinity in them and that they've been set apart by God from the beginning of time, and that his destiny for them is not to be, killed in the uterus. And so, but that you have to believe the religion in a kind of, in your rationality, you have to believe it in order for that to be the way that you break down the world. So without that, I don't think that there's really good grounds for someone to, other than religious grounds, I don't think there's great grounds to deny somebody the right to abortion. Do you know what I mean? In the same way, and let me finish that sentence. In the same way that you, without that same, I need to clean up a bit of a mess that I don't want to make here. I can say the exact same thing about a mother's right to kill her 2-year-old. And I would say the right for her to do that is the exact same. It's the reason that we think that she has the right, that she doesn't have the right to kill her 2-year-old, the reason our entire society is structured
around you don't kill your kids. You know, the
Mhm.
reason that we have that is because of our Judeo-Christian values, because a lot of societies in the past did not believe that.
Mhm.
Yeah, a lot of people sacrifice their kids. So yeah, I totally I just don't want to leave a mess of like, oh, it could be,
Yeah,
it could
yeah.
be, it's perfectly rational. What I'm saying is you need the religion, you need the religious structure in order to even say that life is sacred in the first place. And
Mhm.
that's the game that we are all playing. Like we all believe that in Western culture, we all believe that humans are divine, that we all have like a
Yeah.
spark of divinity. So
Yeah. And that's why the founding fathers also said that the system they're creating is not going to work without a moral and religious people.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, something that came to mind while you were saying that is I heard recently that this is going to make me sound like I'm totally out of touch with pop culture, and I guess I'm okay with that. But I've never listened to Louis C.K. He's a comedian, I guess, one of the best, according to my friend I was talking to the other day. He was saying that he did a piece about abortion, and he came out at the beginning, and I think he walked out on stage. This is all, I haven't even seen it. This is according to my friend. He walked out on stage and said, so let's talk about abortion. And have you seen what I'm talking about?
No.
Yeah, I should probably watch it. We should both probably watch it. And I guess he's pretty vulgar. And so, yeah, if you're listening to this and consider watching it, just know that about this guy. But he basically, he's a comedian saying funny things about people who are like protesting outside of Planned Parenthoods and things. But he's like, but those, he's actually kind of advocating for them and saying like, hey, but actually these people think you're killing babies. So like, of course they're out there protesting. Like you might not think that, but if you thought people were killing babies inside of a place, like, could you, like, of course you'd be in the same position too. And so he's basically saying, so we're in this cultural, these are my words, not his, we're in this cultural moment where some people believe that's killing babies and other people just think of that as like the same thing as going to the doctor for some kind of like routine checkup or something. Like it's just not that different from them. I think there's a major flaw in that because along with my belief system, I also believe that people have, I do believe that truth is more self-evident to people than a lot of people are willing to admit. So I think that a lot of people who get abortions actually know it's wrong, but want to do it still. So anyway, that's getting to a whole nother thing. But what was so interesting to me was that he said, let's be honest though, like, so some people think it's killing babies. Some people just think it's a clump of cells, but let's be honest, it's killing babies. And this fully secular, from what I understand, very vulgar comedian is saying from his stage, hey, abortion is killing babies, but I think that mothers should have the right to kill babies.
Right.
And so I was so surprised to hear that he laid that out like so honestly. I mean, have at least, I guess, in a way it makes me lose all respect for him, but at the same time I'm like, well, at least he's being that honest about it. And so I think that just kind of goes to show how this is a real dilemma, and it is definitely a fruit of not recognizing and appreciating, sticking up for the value of every human life, regardless of of which category it falls into.
Right. Yeah, totally. But even though if I had it my way, there would not be, and I think almost everybody would say this, if I had it my way, there would not be a single another abortion, just in the same way that there would not be any other murder in the world. Even though that's true, I will defer back to our last conversation about the pursuit of truth and why I think that truth is so valuable. I don't want to compromise my pursuit of truth or reality on the altar of expedience of this is my viewpoint and I want to get there. I don't want to sacrifice the means in order to get to the ends. So I'm going to challenge what you're saying, because to me, if the world is if you're either going to break it down into this is a baby or this isn't a baby, I think either one of those, like what I'm talking about is of conception, which is typically the pro-life view of abortion. I would say either one of those is ultimately, people do not act out that they believe that. Like, I would say people who are on the pro-life side, including you and I, do not actually believe that those are babies, that those are human beings, full human beings from the moment of conception. I would say that is not a reasonable position. And I would say, would I say that? I would say it's hard to make the case that that's a reasonable position. But the whole thing's very messy. So I'm not saying there's a perfectly reasonable explanation, and that's not it. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the people who think those are all babies are quite irrational, just like the people who say, oh, I would never kill a baby, or I would never kill a toddler. I could never kill my toddler, but a month before they're born, I could kill them. Like, I think both of those are totally irrational.
Okay. So somewhere in between is where you land.
Not
ideally. You've already said clearly, ideally, you wouldn't want to see another abortion at all. But in terms
of what we do, in terms of policy,
practically moving forward,
the way that we view the world. Because
what?
here's my question. So let me put you straight on the spot then. Do you think that from conception, that is a human at 100%, like they are a human the same way that anybody else is a human?
I believe that
you say that they should be given the same protection that every other human should be given?
I believe that there is a this is getting pretty spiritual and pretty specific to my Christian faith, but I believe that there is a real soul given to that new human life. So from the moment of conception, I believe that there is a soul attached to that new, and I think that's what actually makes it an actual life and not a clump of cells. And so whether you say it's I don't know, is the first stage go back to biology class, is a zygote and then fetus and then baby? Is that how it goes?
There's more in there, but
yeah, those are a few of the steps in there. So I do believe that there's a soul attached to that new clump of cells that is a person, but I also recognize that very obviously, like a couple of cells that have just been joined together is obviously physically very different than a fully formed baby during somewhere in the second trimester. Yeah, It's clearly a different thing.
Does that distinction matter? Like, why do you even say that? Why do you even make that distinction? Does it matter in terms of like their rights? Do they have, say, the inalienable right to life, the way that I believe all human beings outside of the womb, let's just start there. All human beings do have the same right given to us by our creator or given to us by the laws of nature, whichever you prefer. I would say that we need to operate in a world where every human individual has the right to life. Would you say that's true for every fetus and also every like zygote? And at what point would you kind of confer that? That's what I'm asking.
Yeah, that is a tough question, and you are putting me right on the spot. But I mean, I want to say yes. But I also feel like realistically, it's hard for me to honestly say yes, that from the moment of conception, every right that applies to every human is instantly granted. Like I said, I do believe that there is a soul released from heaven or from wherever it comes from, that is real and exists at that moment. And so, thinking about it spiritually in that way, like I want to say yes, but at the same time, it's hard to realistically say yes. And getting really personal with it, like, I mean, I can say from personal experience, it doesn't feel like the same thing. My wife went through having a miscarriage, and it was sad. It was really, really hard for her, emotionally and physically. For me, honestly, I felt pretty detached from the situation for the most part. And I was sad. I was a little bit sad. I was disappointed at, it's like, oh, we just found out this exciting news together. We're starting to think about things we've never thought about before, and we're so excited. And again, I believe that there's a soul now, this tiny little invisible to the naked eye person in there that's, on the process of becoming a baby and being born. But, when she had a miscarriages fairly early on, there's no like formed baby. And so it's clearly a different thing. And I have two born daughters now who, it would be unimaginable for me to think about going through the process of losing one of them. Whereas, I was largely, how do I say it? I don't want to misspeak about this because it feels important. I was much less emotionally affected, much less emotionally affected by that miscarriage than I would be to losing one of my already born daughters, or even that I imagine I would have been if we would have lost one of them or that same baby a number of weeks or months later. So there's from my personal experience, totally. And honestly how I am interpreting it through the lens of my own life.
Let me say the exact same thing, which will validate what you're saying, because to me, if we had lost our kids 2 days after we met them, that would have been two human beings who passed away, but the emotional attachment and the effect it would have had on me would be so much different than it would be today after 2.5 years. So I feel like that's a similar way to break it down. It's like, it's not that they're any less valuable then than they are now.
And for clarity, if that didn't make sense, your kids are adopted, and so you met them after they were born, not if if
our
that didn't
kids, yes.
For somebody that didn't know that, they might have so
exactly. So and obviously it would have been tragic, but it would have been very different to me and my life. So the reason I'm kind of like pointing that out, or the reason I'm saying that is we're kind of on a bit of a tangent because this isn't so much to do with what we're talking about, but it's a really good conversation.
Yeah, it's okay.
And we got here naturally. So the reason I'm saying that is just because like a year ago at this time, I would have been with anybody. I was the group of life 100% starts at conception, which I do. Obviously, life starts at conception. That is technically true. That is, fact check true. Life starts at conception. Human life starts at conception. The human starts at that moment of conception. But when it comes to how we act towards different people, including those human lives who have been conceived, I would say that it is actually reasonable to treat them differently. And that I think you need to start treating them in accordance with personhood over the course of the first few weeks. And I think a perfectly reasonable, in terms of abortion, a perfectly reasonable way to draw the line, in my opinion, would be something like a very short window. I've thought about this like a lot. So this is the conclusion of skipping all the thought, just getting to the conclusion. In my opinion, I think that there should be a very short window of time after a child is conceived that the mother should have the right to end that child's life under certain circumstances. I would say within the first week of conception, you could draw a line. Maybe it's 2 days after, maybe it's 7 days after. I would say within a couple of weeks, that's too far. I would say that transfer, that gradient, when I first started thinking about this, I thought it has to be black or white. And I tried to die on that hill. And my conscience, myself, really, in Freudian terms, my like something inside of me didn't let me die on that hill, and I tried so hard. But in the end, where I've fallen is there is this gradient, and it has to happen within the first few weeks. Like by the time there's a heartbeat, by the time that mother has had the chance to decide what she's going to do with her life, and she's chosen to continue having this baby grow inside of her. Even you could, I think another reasonable line to draw would be implantation, which is about a week after. And at that point, at implantation, I think it's reasonable to say a baby who's implanted in the on the inner uterine wall, given all natural circumstances, they are going to grow into a full adult and then die a natural death, the same way that every other human being is going to be. And so I would say from that kind of natural process of things argument, I think that's a reasonable place to draw the line. But the point I'm getting across is I would say it's unreasonable to give all of those rights to that single cell organism who has this divine potential written on their genetics. There is this divinity to them, but we cannot treat that conceived ovum as the same way that we would treat a 5-year-old or an adult. And so it's kind of messy because it's like, well, do they have the rights or do they not? And I would say if you have to draw that line, I would want to draw it somewhere around a week or something. That way, if somebody is in, say they are in a state that is not like, say they're in a place where they don't want to have a child, but they have one conceived inside of them. Either that's rape, or maybe they're drunk, or it's a bad decision that they make one night. I would say taking the morning after pill sucks, but I am, from a policy and from a public position, I am okay with that. Which this is my first time saying that, because I've said the opposite. I've said so many times that I'm not okay with that. But over probably the last 9 months or so, I've decided that no, I am okay with that. You need to make that prescription. And once you make that prescription, you can save all the lives that are being killed afterwards if you can make that prescription. Because to me, what I care about is all the 7-month-old fetuses who are getting killed. That is, we should all agree that's terrible. And so, anyway, that's where I would draw the line. Yeah,
man, I like that we got here naturally and got to talk about this a little bit, because it is so important. If there's one thing that I could, well, not, there's a couple, maybe I can think of 3, but I would say pro-life activism is one of the things that I feel like I could drop everything that I'm doing right now and go work for one of these pro-life activist organizations and never regret it. I think I could give my whole rest of my life to that. And however long it took for legislation to change and for babies to stop getting killed, I don't think I'd ever regret doing that with my life. And so I think because this is something we're both passionate about, we ended up coming here. It's like we just had to say one thing about it, and we were both ready to talk it through. So I love that.
This is a conversation that is so much bigger and longer we will have.
We're just touching on the surface of a much bigger conversation. But I'm glad that thanks for being honest about that. I know this has been a particular issue of passion and, dedicated research for you, much more so even than me. And so, appreciate you being honest a little bit with just, part of your journey in that. And maybe let's come back to that in another episode, and we'll plan to do a deeper dive into kind of your personal progression through that and lay out more of where we're both standing. But I'm glad that we could be honest about it today.
Yeah. And we can have full episodes about different policies, different politics soon. I think there's still foundational things that we want to make sure that we're seeing clearly before we get there. One last thing I'll say about it, though, is just one of the things that changed my mind was something maybe you've never heard before. Maybe this will be your first time hearing.
Okay.
Did you know that 2/3 of conceived human life that they do not successfully implant, and that they just end up being passed through the uterus and they just die naturally. Did you know that?
No, I didn't.
Yeah. So that created a bit of a problem to me, because if you're going to draw the hard line at conception, then how come there's no pro-life people who are trying to save 2/3 of humanity? Like literally billions and billions of people who are dying. How come there's no research about how it can make sure that every conceived human life is implanted and they don't die? And I realized, as that was one of a few things, we could get more into it when we have time, but that was one of a few things that I realized. Not only did I realize, okay, people aren't acting that out, so they don't truly believe it, I also realized I would not act that out. And so I don't truly believe it. And that's what helped me get to realizing that there is this slight gradient, and I wouldn't act that out. I would care more about a 5-year-old, and I would care more about someone who's 3 weeks from being delivered, somebody, a baby who is, say 4 months along in gestation. I would care more about saving their lives than I would about doing research to try and save the literally billions of humans who are dying because they're not implanting.
Of conceived humans who do not implant and are flushed out of the uterus. And
right.
Wow.
And
so I didn't know that. That does raise a serious dilemma for pro-life activists who've drawn that black and white distinction.
Right.
It's a good point.
Yeah.
More to come on future episodes of Adopt Responsibility.
We went from individual sovereignty to babies.
Hey, it fits. It's in that vein for sure.
Yeah, great. Well, that was an awesome episode. Man, thanks so much. Let's keep hammering. I'm about to interview a man named Jordan Taylor next week. So.
Oh, nice. All right.
All right, man. Thanks.